Yes, I did. I didn't know how much I could tell because I am so private. But I felt I want to be the one, not somebody else.
Only few people within a very small circle knew about the storage units that belonged to Elvis Presley. And when a locksmith was finally hired to open them, the contents told a story that the public had never been given access to. But shockingly, one particular unit was empty. What could have been there, and who had gotten to it first? The secret storage units Elvis Presley lived his life in layers. There was the version the world saw. The stage, the lights, the costumes, the screaming crowds. And then there was everything else. The private man who collected things, who held onto objects that meant something only to him, who filled rooms and spaces with the evidence of a life lived at full speed. Most people never knew those spaces existed, but they did. And what was inside them told a story no concert ever could. Graceland was the heart of it all. The mansion on Elvis Road in Memphis had been his home since 1957, and over the years it had absorbed an enormous amount of his life. Rooms were filled with furniture, awards, gifts from fans, and personal items that ranged from the sentimental to the extravagant. But Graceland itself was only part of the picture. Elvis was a man who owned things on a scale that the main house simply could not contain. So, storage became necessary, and storage units became an extension of his world. The units were not far from Graceland. They sat close enough that Elvis or anyone trusted in his circle could reach them without much effort. They were rented under arrangements meant to keep them out of public view, and for the most part, that worked. And fans who camped outside the gates of Graceland had no idea these units existed. The press, which followed Elvis's every move during his lifetime, had no real knowledge of them either. They were one of the few private things left in a life that had very little privacy in it. What went into those units was a reflection of how Elvis lived. He was a generous man who gave away cars, jewelry, and money without hesitation. But he was also someone who kept things. Stage costumes from different eras of his career were carefully stored away. Items connected to his films, props, wardrobe pieces, promotional materials, found their way into boxes and trunks. Personal correspondence, photographs, and documents that he had not discarded were packed and placed inside. The units held the overflow of a life that had produced more than any single home could hold. There were also items with deep personal meaning. Elvis had a strong attachment to the people and places that shaped him. Objects connected to his mother, Gladys, who passed in 1958 and whose loss affected him for the rest of his life, were among the things he held onto most carefully. Items from his childhood in Tupelo, Mississippi, things that represented where he came from before fame changed everything, were part of what he kept close even when close meant a locked unit a short drive away. These things were meant to survive. Some of the contents reflected his professional life in ways that went beyond the obvious. Elvis had been one of the most documented entertainers in American history, and that documentation produced a vast paper trail. Contracts, correspondence with managers and producers, records of dealings with the music industry, and materials connected to his relationship with Colonel Tom Parker were part of the estate's broader archive. Not all of it lived at Graceland proper. Some of it ended up in storage, filed away rather than destroyed, preserved in the kind of plain containers that gave no hint of what was inside. The units also held things that spoke to his personal interests outside of music. Elvis was fascinated by religion, philosophy, and spiritual ideas. He read widely and collected books, many of them marked up with his own notes. Certain volumes and materials connected to his spiritual journey were among the belongings stored away from the main house. He was also deeply interested in law enforcement, and items connected to that passion, badges, credentials, gifts from officers, were part of the collection. The storage units were, in a sense, a museum of the things he cared about. By the time Elvis passed away in August 1977, the units had been accumulating for years. Some items had been placed there deliberately, with full awareness of what they were and why they mattered. Others had arrived more casually, moved out of Graceland to make room, or simply set aside during one of the many periods of change in his life. The units were not organized in any formal sense. They were the result of years of living and collecting and storing, with no particular system and no plan for what would happen to any of it once he was gone. After his demise, is that the units became part of a much larger and more complicated picture. Elvis left behind an estate that required management, legal attention, and difficult decisions about what to preserve, what to sell, and what to pass on. The storage units were one piece of that puzzle, known to a small number of people, but not immediately prioritized in the chaos that followed his passing. They sat, mostly undisturbed, while the rest of the estate moved through the early stages of probate and reorganization. Whatever was inside them waited, and for a while, no one was in any particular hurry to look. Time to confront the past. When Elvis passed away, the world grieved loudly. Fans gathered outside Graceland by the thousands. News coverage ran around the clock. The funeral drew massive crowds, and the days that followed felt, to many people, like the end of something that could never be replaced. But inside the walls of the estate, grief had to exist alongside practicality. There was a huge amount of work to be done, and very little time to simply stop and mourn. The business of death, especially that of someone as famous and financially significant as Elvis, moved fast, whether anyone was ready or not. The estate Elvis left behind was large, complex, and in some ways troubled. He had earned large sums over the course of his career, but spending had been equally excess. The entourage he kept around him, the properties he maintained, the cars he gave away, the renovations he funded, and the general cost of living, as Elvis Presley had taken a serious toll on his finances. By the time he was gone, the estate was not in the strong position that outsiders assumed it must be. They, the people responsible for managing what he left behind, faced significant challenges from the very beginning. Priscilla Presley, his former wife and the mother of his daughter Lisa Marie, became one of the central figures in the effort to stabilize and rebuild the estate's value. Working alongside professional managers and legal representatives, she helped steer the estate toward a more sustainable footing. This included making decisions about Graceland itself, about licensing and merchandise, about what to preserve and what to sell, and eventually about every corner of Elvis's physical legacy, including the storage units that had sat untouched since his passing. The decision to open the units did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when someone declared that the time had come. Instead, it was a gradual process driven by the practical demands of estate management. Inventories had to be completed, assets had to be identified and assessed, legal requirements around probate meant that everything Elvis owned needed to be accounted for, and that included contents of storage spaces that had never been formally cataloged. The units couldn't stay sealed indefinitely. Eventually, someone had to go in. Timing also played a role. The early years after Elvis's demise were consumed by more immediate concerns. Keeping Graceland running, managing the flow of fan interest, handling the many legal and financial matters that came with settling a large estate. The storage units were known to exist, but they were not seen as urgent. They were one item on a very long list, and that list had many items competing for attention. It was only as the estate began to find its footing, and as the work of full inventory became unavoidable, that the units moved closer to the top of the list. There was also an emotional dimension to the decision. Opening the units meant prying through belongings that had not been touched since Elvis was alive. For those closest to him, that was not a neutral act. These were spaces he had filled himself, or that had been filled on his behalf, and going through them meant encountering his life in a very direct and personal way. The people involved in managing the estate were not strangers to him. Many had known him for years. Still, deciding to open those doors required a kind of readiness, both physical and mental. When the decision was finally made, a locksmith was brought in. The units had standard locks, but the estate did not have complete records of which keys corresponded to which units, and in some cases, the keys had simply been lost in the years since Elvis's passing. Bringing in a professional to handle the locks was the most straightforward solution, and it was handled discreetly, without drawing attention. There was no press presence, no formal ceremony. It was a practical task being carried out by people with a job to do. The locksmith worked through the units methodically. Each door that opened revealed something. Boxes, trunks, covered items, stacked belongings that had been waiting in the dark for years. The process was careful and delicate, with people present to observe and begin the work of cataloging whatever was found. There was a weight to the work that everyone present would have felt, even if none of them said so, and they were. in a very real sense, opening chapters of a life that had ended without warning and left a great deal unfinished. The choice to handle this privately, without publicizing what was being done or what was being found, was consistent with how the estate had approached sensitive matters throughout the years since Elvis's demise. There were good reasons to keep it quiet. The contents of the units were unknown quantities, and until everything had been assessed, there was no way to predict what the inventory might reveal. Caution was the right instinct. And so, the work proceeded behind closed doors in the unannounced way that most of the real business of a famous life tends to get done. The contents found. Inside the doors opened one by one, and with each one, the past came forward. What the storage units held was not the polished, a curated version of Elvis that the world had always seen. It was the unfiltered summary of his life. The things he kept not for show, but for reasons that were entirely his own. Some items were immediately recognizable, others required context. All of it, taken together, painted a portrait of a man far more complex and layered than the image that had been sold to the public for 2 decades. The costumes were among the first things that drew attention. Elvis had worn some of the most iconic stage attires in the history of entertainment, and a number of pieces from different periods of his career were stored in the units. These were not duplicates or replicas. They were the real garments, jumpsuits, capes, belts, and accessories that had been on his body during performances seen by millions of people. Some were in excellent condition, carefully wrapped and stored. Others showed the wear of actual use, which made them even more significant. They were working clothes from a working life. Personal photographs were found in significant numbers. Elvis had been photographed constantly throughout his career, but the photographs in the units were different from the professional shots that had circulated publicly. Many were pictures from private moments, family gatherings, time spent at Graceland. There were images of people he loved, taken in settings that were never meant to be seen outside of his inner circle. These images captured an ordinariness that the stage version of Elvis rarely showed, and finding them in a storage unit rather than on display said something about the care he took to protect what was truly private. OB documents made up another significant portion of what was found. Elvis had been at the center of a commercial enterprise for more than 20 years, and the paperwork that enterprise generated was substantial. Papers linked to his recording career were among the materials stored away. There were letters, some personal and some professional, that had been set aside rather than discarded, financial records from various periods of his life that showed how his business affairs had been managed. None of this was organized in any particular way. It was the proof of a busy life, stored without a clear system, but preserved nonetheless. Items connected to his mother Gladys surfaced among the contents, and their presence said a great deal about what Elvis valued most. He had never fully recovered from her demise, and those who knew him well understood that she remained a central presence in his life long after she was gone. Objects that had belonged to her, keepsakes from the years before fame, and photographs of the family during his childhood in Tupelo were carefully kept. These were not items with obvious commercial value. They were items that mattered because of what they represented, the life he came from, and the woman who had shaped him most. Books were another notable find. Elvis was a serious and wide-ranging reader, something that often surprised people who had formed their image of him entirely from his performances. The books found in the units reflected his deep interest in self-understanding, spirituality, philosophy. Many were heavily annotated, filled with underlines, margin notes, and passages he had marked for reasons that could only be guessed at from the outside. These books had been actively used, thought about, and returned to. They revealed an inner life that rarely found its way into public conversation. Items connected to his passion for law enforcement were also present. Elvis had a lifelong fascination with police work and had collected badges, credentials, and related objects over the years. Some of these had been given to him as gifts by law enforcement agencies he had worked with, and others reflected his own efforts to obtain official recognition in that world. The collection was large enough to suggest that this was not a passing interest, but something he had actively pursued and maintained. It's finding these items in storage rather than on display underlined how much of his real personality had been kept out of public view. Film-related materials rounded out a significant portion of the inventory. Elvis had made 31 movies, and the evidence of that career was present in the units in various forms: wardrobe pieces, promotional items, and behind-the-scenes materials connected to specific productions were among the things found. Some of these had obvious historical value for anyone studying his film career. Others were more personal, souvenirs of experiences that had mattered to him, regardless of how the films themselves were received by critics or audiences. Taken as a whole, what was found across the units told the story of a man who held on to the things that anchored him. Fame had made his life enormous and public. But the contents of those storage units pointed toward the parts of himself he had never offered up for public consumption. What was found was, in many ways, the most honest version of Elvis Presley that had ever been assembled in one place. Honest, precisely because no one had ever been meant to see it all at once. But there was one particular unit that formed a gap with all of it. The empty unit. Everything up to that point had followed a pattern. Each unit had yielded something. There were always boxes, always items wrapped or stacked or carefully placed against the walls. The process had settled into a kind of rhythm. The lock turned, the door swung open, and the work of cataloging began again. The people present had anticipated what the units contained. What they had not expected was what one of them did not. When a particular unit was opened, the beam of light that entered found nothing to land on. The space inside was bare, not partially empty, not cleared out in a hurry with a few things left behind. Completely bare. The floor was clean. The walls held nothing. No boxes, no trunks, no covered shapes, no loose items pushed into corners. Whatever had been in that unit was gone, and it had been removed so thoroughly that almost no trace of it remained. In a process full of discoveries, this was the most disturbing one of all. The unit had not always been empty. That much was established relatively fast. There were records, incomplete, but present, indicating that the unit had been occupied. It had been rented and maintained alongside the others, which would have made no practical sense if it had never held anything. As rental costs were not trivial, and no one in Elvis Circle kept unnecessary expenses without reason. Something had been stored there. The question that immediately followed wasn't whether the unit had once been full, but when it had been emptied, and by whom. Access to the units had been limited to a small number of people during Elvis' lifetime. He was not someone who shared information about private storage arrangements casually. The circle of people who knew about the units, let alone had physical access to them, was tight. After his passing, that circle had not grown significantly. The estate was managed carefully, and access to physical locations connected to the estate required authorization. Finding out who could have entered that particular unit and removed its contents meant looking closely at a very short list of names. The timing of the removal was also something to worry about. There was no precise record of when the unit had last been known to contain anything. The documentation that existed was fragmentary, the kind of informal record-keeping that often surrounds private storage arrangements. It was clear that the unit had been in use at some point before Elvis's demise. Whether it had been emptied before he passed away or afterward was a question that could not be answered with certainty. Both possibilities carried their own implications, and neither one made the situation simpler. If the unit had been emptied before Elvis passed away, that suggested he had made a decision to remove whatever was stored there. Elvis was not a man who acted randomly when it came to things he cared about. A decision to clear out a storage unit would have been intentional, and it would have been carried out with a specific purpose in mind. That purpose was not recorded anywhere. The contents were not transferred to Graceland, at least not in any way that could be traced. They did not appear in the inventories of other units. Whatever had been removed had gone somewhere, but where that somewhere was remained unclear. If the unit had been emptied after his passing, the implications shifted considerably. In the period following Elvis's passing, there had been a great deal of movement around his estate. People who had been close to him were dealing with grief, with sudden changes in their own lives, and with the end of a way of life that had organized their world for years. The access that certain individuals had to Elvis properties did not disappear immediately upon his demise. There was a window, short period, during which the kind of removal that would explain the empty unit could have taken place without immediate detection. What the unit had contained was never definitively established. Speculation was inevitable, and it ranged widely. Some who were familiar with how Elvis managed his private affairs believed the unit may have the kind of sensitive personal or financial materials that someone might have strong reasons to want removed from an official inventory. Others thought it may have contained items of personal value. things that a person close to Elvis might have taken as a form of tribute, or maybe something less charitable than either, without knowing what had been there, is that the absence could be interpreted in almost any direction. The physical condition of the unit offered very little help. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. The lock had been intact when the locksmith arrived, which meant that whoever removed the contents had done so with a key or with legitimate access. That detail narrowed the possibilities without eliminating the uncertainty. Access and authorization were not always the same thing, and the fact that entry had been made without breaking anything didn't mean the removal had been sanctioned. It meant only that whoever did it had known how to get in. The empty unit told a different kind of story entirely. The unexplained mystery. Some questions get answered eventually. Time passes, records surface, someone talks, and the shape of a mystery becomes clear enough to close. The empty unit was not one of those questions. The years that followed the discovery did not produce a clean resolution. What had been inside it, who had removed it, and what purpose that removal had served remained stubbornly unresolved, folded into a longer story about Elvis's final years and the complicated world that surrounded him at the end of his life. The estate's management moved forward without ever making a public statement about the empty unit. That silence was not unusual. The people responsible for protecting Elvis's legacy had always been careful about what they confirmed publicly and what they left alone. But it meant that the absence of an explanation became its own kind of explanation, at least in the minds of people who had been closely connected to the estate. When something is not addressed, attention tends to settle on it rather than move past it. The empty unit became a fixed point in conversations about what had really gone on in the final days of Elvis's life. Colonel Tom Parker remained a subject of intense scrutiny in those years, and not only because of the empty unit. Parker had managed Elvis since the mid-1950s, and his hold over Elvis's career had been total, only known after Elvis was gone. The financial arrangements between them were examined and found to be deeply unbalanced, with Parker taking percentages that far exceeded what was standard in the industry. After Elvis' passing, Parker continued to assert authority over the estate until legal action was taken to remove him from that position. Whether any of his actions extended to the physical contents of Elvis' storage remained an open question. The people who had been closest to Elvis in his final years, the men who traveled with him, lived at Graceland, and were present for the last difficult stretch of his life, carried information that was never fully extracted by any official process. Some of them wrote books, some gave interviews, some said very little publicly, and kept the details of those years a secret until the end of their own lives. What they knew about the storage units, about the empty one in particular, was never successfully uncovered. The informal nature of life inside Elvis' circle meant that knowledge was distributed unevenly, and that not everyone who knew something was ever asked the right question. The financial state of the estate gave another angle of consideration. When the full scope of Elvis' financial situation became clear, in the years after his passing, it was evident that significant sums had moved without being well documented. Money and valuables had flowed outward in many directions during his lifetime, and the people who had been close to him had not always been acting in his long-term interest. Whether the contents of the empty unit were linked to any of these financial patterns was impossible to say with certainty, but the context made the question a reasonable one. Where value could disappear, value had disappeared. Lisa Marie Presley, who inherited her father's estate at the age of 9 and came into full control of it at 25, spent years navigating the outcome of decisions that had been made before she was old enough to understand them.
Her relationship with her father's legacy was complicated by the actions of others and by the large scale of what she had inherited. What she was told about the storage units, or about the empty one specifically, was never made part of the public record. She was a child when Elvis passed away and when the units were opened. Whatever knowledge she came to have about those events arrived through the accounts of others. The broader pattern of unexplained gaps in the Elvis estate gave the empty unit a context that made it feel less like an isolated incident and more like one instance of something larger. Items that should have been present were sometimes not. Records that would have clarified important questions were incomplete or missing. Meanwhile, the people best positioned to answer certain questions were often also the people with the greatest reasons not to. The estate was not unique in this regard. The aftermath of any large life tends to produce gaps.
But the scale of Elvis' fame meant that each gap attracted a level of scrutiny that some never face. What the empty unit ultimately represented was the limit of what could be known. The physical evidence was gone. The people who might have explained it were either unwilling to do so or no longer alive. What remained was the shape of an absence, clear enough to see, impossible to fill. In a life as thoroughly documented as Elvis Presley's, that absence carried a particular kind of weight. It suggested that even after all the books, all the films, all the exhibitions and archives and oral histories, there were still parts of his story that had been deliberately removed from reach. The empty unit was opened and found to be empty, and no one who knew why ever said so publicly. That fact settled into the longer history of Elvis's life, not as a solved problem, but as an open one. A door that had been unlocked, but led, in the end, to nothing that could be seen or named or understood. It remained one of the quieter mysteries of an era full of them, waiting in the manner of all genuinely unanswered things. Do you think Elvis could have removed what was contained in the empty unit before his passing to prevent it from being found?